Welcome to Ind AS 116 Leases. What is a lease? A lease is a contract that conveys the right to use of an asset, an underlying asset, for a period of time in exchange of consideration. So, lease is a contract between two parties. One is the lessor, who is the legal owner of the underlying asset. Who is a legal owner? Who owns legally an asset for the benefit of others. So, he provides the asset to the lessee, who is the beneficial owner. That means who enjoys the benefit of an asset without being the owner of that. So, there are three things. One is there are two entities. One is lessor, another is lessee, and in between them there is one underlying asset that is the subject of the lease. So, I repeat, a lease is a contract between two parties, lessor and lessee. The lessor provides and lessee obtains what? An underlying asset. Lessor provides the right to use. He is not transferring control. Remember this. Transferring control, it's a sale, it's not, it's a lease. He is conveying the right to use that underlying asset which lessee obtains. Now, it is for a period of time that is called here lease term. Lease term. Who will decide what is the lease term? Lessee. A lessee has to determine the period for which a lease is legally enforceable. It starts from the date of commencement of the lease and ends on when the asset is returned to the lessor after this period. So, in between this period is called lease term, for which the owner provides the right to use to lessee. Last is in exchange of consideration. That is called what? Lease payments. All contracts create rights and obligations. So, each of the party, lessor has one right, one obligation, lessee has one right, one obligation. What is right for the lessor? Obligation for the lessee. What is obligation for the lessor? Right for the lessee. What is his right? That is to get lease payments from the lessee. Why? Because he has an obligation to provide the right of use assets. What is lessee's right? To obtain the right of use for that lease term. What is the obligation? To pay lease payments to lessor. So, I repeat the whole thing. Lease is a contract between two parties, lessor and lessee. Lessor is the legal owner, lessee is the beneficial owner. He provides the right to use to lessee. What? An underlying asset, that is the subject of the lease. That is for a period of time that is called lease term. Who decides? Lessee decides. He has to determine. And lastly, for in exchange of consideration. Who decides? Who provides the right to use. Next slide. What is the objective? to set out the principles for the recognition, measurement, presentation and disclosure of leases. So there are 4 things: recognition, measurement, presentation and disclosure. What is a recognition? Recognition is capturing an item that defines what? Asset or liability or income or expense. So, lessee recognizes in the balance sheet at the commencement date 1 right of use asset. This is actually lease asset, and 1 lease liability. This is recognition. Capturing an item that meets the definition of an asset or a liability, and also related income and expenses. In the PL, this is the balance sheet. In the PL, he will recognize what? 1 expense, that is the lease payment. So, capturing an item that meets the definition of an asset and liability. Now, to assess whether a contract contains a lease, the first thing that we have to see that a lessee records a lease asset and 1 lease liability. So, this is recognition. Recognition for a lessor assets. He has 1 asset PPE, that is removed, derecognized. What is recognized? Net investment in the lease. This is recognition for a lessor. He has 1 asset that is transferred to the lessee. So, what is having in that place? Net investment in the lease. That is what? This is present value of lease receivables. This is called recognition. And in the PL, he will record the lease receipts. That's his income. So, this is recognition. So, recognition is just capturing an item that meets the definition of an asset or a liability and related income and expenses. What is measurement? Accounting is a measurement process. Everything has to be measured. After recognition, asset, liability, income, expense, everything has to be measured in terms of money. Money measurement concept. Anything cannot be expressed in terms of money are not recognized. So here, same thing, measurement. Suppose lessee, he recognizes what? 1 asset, right of use asset, 1 lease liability. How does he measure this? How do we measure an asset that we get for what we pay for? If I buy something for 10,000 rupees, 10,000 coming in, 10,000 going out cash. If I do not pay, no cash outflow, we incur one liability. Asset debit to liability for asset. Here what happens? The same thing. I write one ROU for which I don't make any payment. What is my obligation? I obligation to make lease payments. So what is the present value of lease payments? That is the basis for measurement of ROU. So first we measure what is my lease liability. That means my future obligation. What is the present value of that? Somebody given the lessee the asset, lessee has to pay 10,000 for 5 years. Total amount to be paid 50,000. What is the present value of 50,000? That is that become the basis for ROU. This is measurement. Third thing is presentation. How do we present the thing? There is one standard, presentation of financial statements. In the balance sheet, lessee will show what? I have certain owned assets, PPE, and I also have return of right of use assets. This is the owned asset, this is the lease assets. So I present, people can make out. This is the asset I own, this is the asset taken on lease. Now I make a distinction between my lease liability along with my financial liability. Distinction from this lease related to this, and others are financial liabilities. So presentation has to be the now. This lease liability, this interest payment of the thing will affect my cash flow. Interest part will affect my operating cash flow, and payment part is my financing activity. So what is operating activity? Interest part, financing activity, repayment of my principal. So anytime I pay something, one part is interest, one part is my repayment of principal. Third is disclosure. What is disclosure? Disclosure means anything which cannot be recorded in the main accounting part. If you see any annual report of any companies in the world, you will see 5% that is PL, balance sheet, other comprehensive income, after the balance sheet changes in equity, cash flow, everything, and 95% is notes. You will see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These are all notes. So any information which cannot be shown here, ROU asset. One asset is not an asset on the balance sheet. This will provide me expected future economic benefits. So how do I depreciate? Today the value is 10,000. At the end of the list term, the value should be 0. How it will be 0? That will be disclosed. Lease liability. A liability is not a liability in the balance sheet debt. How that liability will be repaid? That will be one disclosure. Okay? Second thing is coming to ensure that lessees and lessors provide relevant information in a manner that faithfully represent those transactions. What is faithful representation? Suppose I get one asset, government grant 10,000 rupees, I don't pay for it. Should I record it? An asset should be recorded only when we pay for it, but if we don't pay, no. This is not faithful representation. I need to show that one asset I have got 10,000 rupees for which I credit one left hand side, some obligation I write. Government grant I have received, that will be transferred to the capital. That is faithful representation. In the balance sheet, I need to show, again I am telling you, distinction between owned assets and leased assets. We cannot combine these two. That is faithful representation. On the liability side, we write lease liability, financial liability. They are different. My obligation paid to the lessor for leased assets, and obligation for other liabilities. That is called faithful representation. I distinguish between, I repeat, owned asset, leased assets. financial liability, lease liability. To see the effect that leases have on the financial position, financial performance and cash flows of an organization. When I pay the lease term, there is reduction in cash flow because I make an lease payment that will affect my operating cash flow, financing cash flow. Profit will be reduced for a lessee, profit will be increased for a lessor. Balance sheet will change because my ROU asset for a lessee, this will be less. Every year you provide depreciation on that. What is the value? After 5 years, lease term will be 0. So I will provide, it will go down. And my lease liability, this will go up when I charge interest and go down when I make the payment. Liabilities go up for the interest charge, value will go down when we make the payment. So it has an effect in the PL both for this depreciation and for the interest. Next slide. Type of leases for lessees, for lessors. It can be three things: right of use asset, what we have been discussing. Right of use is what? That represents lessee's right to use an underlying asset for a period of time. So this is recognized. When we see right of use assets, there is also one lease liability. That is, as per 116, this standard will tell me how to record right of use assets and also the corresponding liability. Now there are two things, that is recognition exemption. Two things. One is short term lease. If a lease is for 12 months or less, this can be taken as just a service arrangement. I don't need to record right of use assets. What I pay is just my expense. So when the lease term is 12 months or less, it's a short term lease, I can record ROU assets, and if I avail of this exemption, I don't need to record. What I pay is my expenses. In the same way, underlying asset is a low value. Low value means low value when it is new. A car may have very low value. A 30-year-old car may have very low value, but here it is low value when the asset is new. So treatment for these two are, you can have exemption of recognition. You may or may not recognize. Here you will have to recognize. But for these two, if you do not recognize, up to you. For the lessee, you can show as what? Expense. Here you will have to classify, elections to be made by class of these assets. And this value is low. This is what? They are very large in numbers but low in value. I have taken on lease 50 tablets. They are large in number but low in value. And lesser having only two things: finance lease and operating lease. First of all, the main distinction is if the lessor transfers substantially all the risks and rewards of ownership incidental to the asset, that is called finance lease. If it is not, it is not a finance lease. I repeat, when the lessor transfers substantially all the risks and rewards of ownership to the lessee, it's a finance lease. If he does not transfer those, it's an operating lease. Now, what are the risks that can be transferred? First risk could be what? Idle capacity. There is some idle time, there is no demand, some idle capacity is my risk. I am not. An asset has to be used in the production of goods and services that will generate revenue. Money will come. Outflow will be less than my inflow. Inflow will be from there. So if there is some capacity that is idle, machine is not used. How the lessee makes use of the RU asset, lessor has nothing to do. He has to get regularly the lease payments. Second thing could be what? Second thing is called obsolescence. Obsolescence can be technological, it can be economic. What is technological obsolescence? It is technically obsolete. To type out a letter, I cannot make use of a typewriter. Nobody will accept nowadays. I need a computer. One typewriter today is technically obsolete. What is economic obsolescence? That I use one asset, but not in a profitable way. I can run a petrol taxi, but I can't justify my profit. Third thing is what? Variation in return. I don't get that much of return what I expected because there is some change in economic scenario, economic conditions. There is not that demand what I expected at the price I will be able to sell. So three things, one is idle capacity, obsolescence, technological, economic, and there can be variation in return due to economic conditions. Rewards. First thing is expected return. From profitable operations. I told you that an asset is to be used in the production of goods and services. So, I am committed to pay lease liability, so I expect that one asset I get that will provide me expected future economic benefits. So, expected return from profitable operation, first thing. Second thing is what? Residual value. A value at the end of the lease term. So I expect to get some value from this realization of that asset at the end of the lease term. That is called residual value. And number three is what? Gain from appreciation in value. Gain from appreciation in value. So there are three things: expected return from profitable operations, residual value, I expect to realize some amount when the asset is discarded at the end of the lease term, and thirdly, there may be some gain in appreciation in value, some holding gain. I taken something on lease, one land for 20 years. There is some holding gain, appreciation in value. So risk and returns are the main thing. When these are transferred, it is finance lease. Not transferred, it is operating lease.